So good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Moritz. I'm a PhD candidate at the so-called Leibniz Institute of Agricultural Development and Transition Economies, which is based in Germany. And today I will present my work entitled Crop Index Insurance for More Welfare and Climate Resilience, an Experimental Approach. My supervisors and my co-authors are Lena Kuhn and Ihtia Bobojonov, and this work is part of the Klimaless project, which is developing and implementing real index insurance options in Central Asia. As we all know, climate shocks pose production risk, and this calls for climate adaptation strategies. These can either be input investments, such as climate resilient seeds or irrigation, but they can also be in the field of microfinance, such as credits and formal insurance concepts. However, problem here is that in many developing countries, the access to these microfinance services is often limited because of budget constraints and or missing markets. And therefore, international organizations, but also scholars, often tout agricultural index insurance to provide remedy here. The question is now, what is index-based insurance? Farmers that are insured with index-based insurance receive a payout based on an index. Let's say we have a drought insurance and we have a precipitation index. Then farmers receive a payout whenever this index falls below a previously defined threshold, which is the minimum precipitation needed for having good yield. Therefore, index-based insurance relies on objective weather information, satellite data, weather station data, can overcome problems of information asymmetries, adverse selection, moral hazard, and can operate under much lower transaction costs. There's one remaining problem that is basis risk, which means that the index is insufficiently correlated to local yields. And this, of course, needs to be overcome. Within the social science literature and their index insurance literature, research has mostly focused on adoption behavior, namely trying to understand the low adoption rate of index insurance in many, many countries. More recently, literature is also shedding light on impact. And this is where I will now contribute to. Within the impact literature, we then differentiate between the so-called ex-ante impact, which is the sole insurance coverage before farmers actually know the weather event, and also the ex-post impact, which is the payout effect. And according to Noritomo and Takahashi, we need to control for both effects simultaneously in order to identify the true impact channel. And the only study that has done this so far is by Noritomo and Takahashi in the field of livestock index insurance in Kenya. And therefore, we need more research trying to better understand the real impacts of index insurance in many other countries, in crop index insurance, livestock index insurance, etc. And this is what this article aims at, to better understand the true impacts of index insurance. My research questions are, what is the impact of crop index insurance on welfare and climate resilience in Uzbekistan? Uzbekistan is a real drought-prone region, and they have problems trying to adapt to droughts and in general, like in a changing climate. Therefore, it's really relevant in this context. I look at the ex-ante impact, but also ex-post impact in leg 1, 2, and 3. Different to other studies in this field, I have two different weather shocks. One is a mild drought, and the second one is a severe drought. And I look at their effects. The idea here is that before this index insurance will be implemented on the market, we want to understand these effects prior to its real implementation. And therefore, we conducted so-called framed field experiments with 199 Uzbek farmers. Framed field experiments, just quickly, they take the advantages of the lab experiment on the one hand and the field experiment on the other hand. So they take the high experimental control from the lab setting, but in this lab setting, they try to implement as much field context as possible. So in our case, we also have farmers that are located in the real pilot region, and we try to understand their behavior before its implementation. I can already tell you that we find positive ex ante and ex post impacts. And the question is now, how do we get there? So the data I used for this analysis, they are first relying on one survey that we conducted with all rain-fed farmers in the pilot region of Uzbekistan. From there, we randomly selected farmers, invited them for experiment participation. And in this experiment, we first introduced them to this innovative index insurance, so they know what it's all about. And then we played insurance games. And these insurance games, they try to simulate farming years. So on the first step, farmers received game money. Believing they're in the beginning of the growing season, they now need to invest this money into different investment options. So first, they need to put money into fixed costs to maintain their business. Then they need to put it into consumption to feed their families. They can also invest into more consumption for reasons of social prestige, for example. They can also invest into fertilizer to increase their yield by up to 30%. They can invest into index insurance to hedge against weather, which in our case is drought. And they can also put money into a savings account under a local deposit rate. So once all the money is distributed, we simulate the weather. The weather in our game can be normal rainfall, few rainfall, or very few rainfall. And then depending on the individual investment decision and exogenous game weather, every farmer has their own individual endowment in the end. So the idea is that they have a hypothetical yield, which they sell on a hypothetical market, and they receive hypothetical revenue. So they receive endowment at the end of the season, which they can then reinvest into the new growing season. And we play this procedure for 5 rounds in order to make farmers get familiar with the concept of index insurance, but also for us to observe dynamics. Important here is that the study design is unique in its complexity as well as focus on replicating real farm and market conditions. We use an index insurance that is marketable, that was developed by a local insurance company to be launched in the region soon. Our rainfall events follow historical local rainfall data, and all other game parameters, they also try to replicate the real farm and market environment. And therefore, we believe that game behavior can be seen as a reasonable approximation of reality. Okay, so what we want to know the ex ante and the ex post impact of crop index insurance on consumption spending, on fertilizer input, on savings, on the end season income, and on external borrowing. As farmers in our game can flexibly decide on whether to buy index insurance or not, there is self-selection into index insurance participation, it's endogenous, and therefore we apply an instrumental variable approach. Unlike other studies in this field, we do not use discount vouchers, which is a very common instrument, simply because it wasn't planned to having any discount vouchers in the real implementation process, which we try to simulate in our game. And therefore, built on adoption research, we instead use exogenous peer insurance behavior as a valid instrument. So the idea is that farmers in groups, they follow the behavior of their surrounding peer. And this is what I also, in fact, find in these data in a previous paper. Okay, however, in the post-drought analysis, which is a subsample analysis in our analysis, we find that this instrument is no longer valid. And then for this subsample analysis, I use an iterative, seemingly unrelated regression instead. And this is because I also know the factors influencing adoption. I know the determinants influencing impact, and then I can just simultaneously control for both. Okay, let's go to the first regression results. Table 1 here shows the average impact effects over all 5 rounds played. We can see that the sole insurance coverage, which is insurance uptake, increases consumption, increases fertilizer input, increases savings, and it decreases external borrowing. So we find that farmers, before knowing the weather event, they already increase in consumption, fertilizer, and savings. So they can be seen as complements to index insurance adoption. Interesting here is that savings, the savings coefficient, is much higher than the consumption coefficient, which shows that farmers, although they invest into index insurance as a risk management solution, they also want to adopt for another risk management alternative, which is savings in this case. They don't just want to rely on index insurance alone. We also find that on average, index insurance participation decreases end season income, and this is simply because on average, farmers pay the premium, but they don't receive indemnity because drought events in the game does not happen every round. We next want to look at the payout effects. And for that, we look at the post-drought seasons individually instead of looking at the average effect. And here I display first, like in the upper table, in the green table, you can see the rounds played and the rainfall for these rounds. They were the same for all farmers. So here we look at the first post-drought season, which is round 3. This is after having few rainfall in the previous season. And we find here that farmers that receive payout in the mild drought season, they have higher consumption spending, a higher probability to invest into fertilizer, they have higher savings, and they have lower amounts they borrow externally. Again, here we find that savings is dominating consumption. So savings seems to be a really important investment strategy for farmers. Okay, next we look at the second post-drought season, which is round 4. This is after farmers receive payouts potentially in round 2, but also in round 3. So after mild and after severe drought. And you find here that farmers that receive payouts in both drought seasons, they invest more into consumption. They have a higher probability to invest into fertilizer. They have higher end season incomes and lower external borrowing. The negative coefficients for savings can probably be explained by farmers once they have a payout that they rather invest into consumption and fertilizer than savings itself. So we see here that effects are similar. We see that the coefficients are stronger than after the mild drought. And then we want to know what happens 1 season later. Do the effects remain? So we look at season 5, which is leg 3 mild drought and leg 2 severe drought. And we do find that the effects remain, but with a diminishing return of scale. All these results are in line with former research. However, this former research does not simultaneously control for the ex ante and the ex post impact. So this is our contribution here. We can say that the estimates, they remain, like they're valid, they're robust, although controlling for these 2 impact channels simultaneously. Yes, as I said, like we see that savings seems to be more important than consumption. So farmers are very much eager to invest into alternative risk management solutions. And we also run robustness tests where we first look at credit as a binary variable. The results are robust. They're also robust when we control for the forbidden regression problems stated by Woodridge, where we look at the first stage regression of the instrumental variable approach in a nonlinear estimation. And also when we regard payouts also as endogenous. Before I come to the conclusion, I want to point out some limitations. First, in any kind of experiment, we always need to ask whether the results we gain from the experiment can predict reality. And here we say that in this game, we only have drought or rainfall as the drought as the only production risk. And this, of course, simplifies reality. But we can see from the survey that drought is actually the most severe production risk that farmers stated. At the same time, we don't look at any inputs into climate adaptation, so irrigation, climate resistant seeds, we don't control for. simply because in Uzbekistan, they're not relevant. A problem we have is that when running all the regressions, we always control for all the other investment decisions. And of course, there is reverse causality. And this is something we cannot really control for, except for the insurance, because we use an instrument and we use iterated seemingly unrelated regression. So we say that this approach is the best approximation to understand the ex ante and ex post impacts of index insurance prior to its real implementation. And therefore, the results provide suggestive evidence of the ex ante and ex post impact of crop index insurance in Uzbekistan in leg 1, 2, and 3. And based on this marketable index insurance option, we say that it can actually be a promising solution for a climate adaptation strategy. And including the narratives, the positive findings on welfare and climate resilience also into promotion activities can then maybe also increase adoption, stimulate farmers to buy in the first place. Okay, so that's it from my side now, and thank you very much for your attention.
Couple of questions.
Yes.
First of all, I saw the order of your games, and I wonder if you are concerned with any order effects there, meaning you signal that drought is getting more severe as the game proceeds, and then it improves again because you end up with two normal years, right? So that's one thing. Second, why do you think index insurance is the most appropriate for drought, given that you know, sometimes these indices are not very well aligned with the geographic areas or the reality of who is actually harmed. And so I'm very curious to hear your opinion about that. And the third question is, do farmers in Uzbekistan have access to this index insurance? Do they?
Okay, so at the point of the experiment, farmers did not have access yet. For them, it was a totally new concept. It was still in the process of being implemented, but farmers in Uzbekistan and generally know about agricultural insurance. There is an agricultural insurance on the market, which they in fact need to buy in order to get credit from the bank. But the problem in Uzbekistan is that it's a failed market, meaning that this insurance does not insure extreme weather events. And therefore, farmers don't really rely on this existing insurance concept. So for us, it was also really important in this experiment to introduce the difference between the traditional agricultural insurance and the index insurance. And regarding your second question, like the validity of the index, another PhD candidate in our project looks at the index, and he finds a very, very high correlation between this drought index insurance and local yields. Of course, it's not 100%, but it's close to 100% in fact. So for this geographical area, we can find an index that can actually, it can really like help to insure farmers when it comes to droughts.
And how about the order effects of your treatment?
The order effects we actually control for in the analysis. So we have like the round fixed effects in the analysis, which we control for.
And were they significant?
They were not, I don't think they were significant. No, I don't have the results here. No, they were not significant. Yeah.
Did you try to capture farmers' risk perceptions? Participants' risk perceptions in your game? It's just fascinating to me that savings tend to overwhelm consumption from your results. And so were farmers more risk averse in spite of insurance and thinking that, well, even if I have insurance, I still need to allocate a lot more to savings, just, you know, so were they just more risk averse or they just want to save?
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, first of all, we do control for risk aversion in the results. I mean, in the general, like in the average estimation, we use fixed effects. So risk aversion doesn't really matter because it's time invariant in the game. For the post-drought analysis, we do control for risk aversion. We also control for distrust into the index insurance concept. And also for a sophisticated understanding of the index insurance. So this is what we control for. We, from our survey, actually know that savings is indeed a very, very important risk management solution for farmers. So we are not like very much surprised about the results, because this is also what you can see here, that in the survey, 63% state savings to be an important risk coping strategy. Yeah.
I can have two questions. One quick clarification question. And your data, is it all from the experiment that you pair then with kind of real farm data, like with your own kind of farm data? Like for example, consumption fertilizer, is that based on the experiment or is that based on their own kind of farm?
It's based on the experiment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And then I have a question, because you said in your talk that basically the experiment is kind of very close to reality. And then you kind of, but I was kind of wondering, there's kind of no real consequences for the farmers. So how would you kind of ensure that this is actually real behavior as opposed to kind of much more risk averse?
Yeah.
Not risk averse, risk loving behavior.
Yeah. So what we told farmers, first of all, in this context, we didn't have to pay farmers any participation fee. This is also different from other contexts, because the local agricultural association invited farmers, which is seen as mandatory for farmers to then participate. We told, when we gave the introduction to the game, we told farmers that the most economic efficient farmers in the game would receive a prize. We didn't specify what the price was. On the poster, there was a nice car that everyone in the rural area wants to have. It was really clear that they will not get the car, but they knew they would get something. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And also, I mean, interesting is also the consumption effects we find in the game, because consumption in the game per se doesn't have any economic benefit. But farmers that invested more into consumption got golden chocolate coins, which they could put in front of them. So it was all blinky blinky in front of them, showing the social prestige. And they were crazy about investing into consumption just for having this golden chocolate coins in front of them. Yeah. So there were incentives, but not like, you know, pure economic incentives in the classical sense.
Mm-hmm. No. Now that you described the process with the coins, chocolate coins, and all of these, are you worried at all that the farmers didn't perceive the experiment as a real context experiment, and they were more perceiving it as a game where I want to show off, for example, having more chocolates compared to my beer and things like that? Because I guess this will affect significantly the allocation of the money.
Very much. I mean, of course, like whenever you conduct experiments, you need to understand the local context. And we know that in Uzbekistan, this consumption spending and showing off is kind of important. So we don't like, it is happening in the game, but we don't think it's different than what it would be in reality. Because the whole experiment started with a 30-minute introduction to the index insurance concept. It was really clear that it's more like an information experiment. Before, like, you know, participating, they didn't know that there would be a game that would maybe be fun. It was more about getting information about this index insurance. So, I mean, yeah, we believe that, you know, it actually resembles reality. Yeah.
It's about the time to move on. Maybe we can take one last question, if there's any. Okay, then we can. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
For your great let's welcome Doris. And you can, I think yours is just here.
Yeah, I think you do. You still have to stop share, I guess, do you? Yeah,
Yeah, you don't need to stop share.
no, I did. Okay, thank you everybody for coming to the session. My name is Doris Lepler. I'm an associate professor at the National University of Galway in Ireland. And I'm presenting work today on framing of agricultural climate change information. So before we begin, I want to draw your attention here at the picture. So this, because my study is based in Ireland, and this is how farming looks like in Ireland. So you already have kind of a clear picture in your head what I'm talking about. So these are dairy cows, as you probably recognized. But the same applies also for kind of beef cattle. So cattle is grazed outside for most of the year. We have a very kind of temperate, kind of rainy climate. So cows are put outside early in the spring. They're all calved, so we have a kind of spring calving system. They're all calved early in the spring, similar to New Zealand. And then the idea is to maximize grass intake of the cows. So while this all looks kind of nice and green and environmentally friendly, there are kind of significant environmental effects like nutrient pollution, for example. But at the moment, and this is what my talk is greenhouse gas emissions. That has become a particular problem. Like in Ireland, it becomes clear why, but obviously also around the world. Okay, so with this in mind, just a kind of general introduction, food systems are responsible for approximately 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, based on a paper from last year. And I think like it's relatively clear now that the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from food production is unavoidable. So we need to do something. There are several strategies, and one of the key strategy is the adoption of greenhouse gas mitigation measures of farmers. And this is what my study is about. So if you're talking about adoption of kind of greenhouse gas mitigation measures, this is just like any other new technologies. We want the farmers to implement new things on their farms, and then information provision plays a key role. So unfortunately, there is a perceived an observed underperformance of information provision, and that can actually stop or impede sustainable food production. In general, I don't have that much time to talk about literature, but in general, the agricultural extension literature shows relatively unclear facts. So some extension programs are successful, while many of them are not. But often this is where this literature stops, and there's very little digging into what is actually going on. Why is that information provision not successful? So one possible reason, and this is coming from the experimental literature, is information underutilization. So what is generally perceived there's a lot of experiments in terms of giving and receiving advice. People on average take much less advice than it would be kind of beneficial for them. If you think about yourself, someone gives you some advice and you probably kind of think you know better, you take a little bit of that advice. And this is kind of what the average person does. What is in line with it, and I'll come back to that later, is also confirmation bias is kind of a little bit of an issue. We kind of often like what we want to hear. If someone tells you something, you like half of it, but you like the other one not so much. So you kind of focus on more of what you really like to hear. Another thing is information avoidance. So generally, there's kind of relatively big literature in economics that people kind of willfully ignore information, generally what they don't like. I like to give a very kind of practical example. Imagine you're going out for dinner, you have a dessert. The waiter puts a chocolate brownie in front of you and asks, do you also want information about calories, sugar, fat content? You probably say no, because you want to enjoy your brownie. So this is kind of the idea of kind of avoiding information. Okay, so this all kind of shows that the provision of information is much more complex than it actually may seem initially. And in this study, we focus on how can we improve the effectiveness of information provision in order to kind of convince farmers to adopt these climate-friendly measures. And here we conduct a survey that included a randomized information experiment with Irish livestock farmers. Give you a little bit of more background about the Irish agricultural sector. So we have a very livestock dependent agricultural sector. There are about 135,000 farms in Ireland. Ireland is a relatively small country. And nearly 90% of those farms have either dairy, beef cattle or sheep. So it's very much livestock focused. And from that, 37% of greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture. So this comes back to why that is actually such a big topic in Ireland at the moment, because this is actually the largest proportion of any sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. To set that in context, in terms of other developed countries, the US or the EU is about 10 to 12% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. The only other developed country that has similar numbers is New Zealand, where I think about 50% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. You can see why this kind of attracts a lot of attention in Ireland at the moment. In terms of the EU has targets, and the EU aims to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. Within the EU, most countries have their own, being part of it, have their own kind of climate plans. And Ireland plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 51% by 2030, and published a climate action plan, another published climate action plan in 2021, where for the first time there were sector-specific reduction targets. So the Irish agriculture sector has a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2030. So you can imagine how much kind of that policy or kind of talk that has kind of introduced now in Ireland. So the key strategy, whether or not they're going to make it is a different question, but the key strategy is to increase the adoption of mitigation measures by farmers. And for that, they have implemented a new extension initiative, which is called the Teagasc Signpost Programme. And this program is specifically aims to convince farmers to take climate action on their farm by implementing a variety of different kind of measures that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So just a little bit more explanation about this Teagasc Signpost Programme. So Teagasc is, that's an Irish word. You kind of probably would think it pronounced differently, but it's pronounced Teagasc. That is a semi-governmental organization. They conduct research, but also mainly they provide advice to farmers. And I would be very confident that pretty much every farmer in Ireland knows about Teagasc. So they have a lot of influence on farmers in terms of advice. And they specifically have the Signpost Programme. Within that Signpost Programme, they are in the process, I have already created 100 demonstration farms across the country, but now because we can visit farms again, farmers can go and look at those practices on the demonstration farm. So that's one part. They have webinars. And then they also have a dedicated website where they provide information to farmers. For example, they have climate action for dairy farmers in March, climate action for dairy farmers in April, and so on, where they have information. And this is what we're specifically interested in, because this is also an online kind of study we did. So, because if you think about, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25%. We need to reach a lot of farmers, because farmers are not completely, they're not getting rid of their cows. They kind of small changes on a lot of farms is kind of the idea here. Okay, so that's kind of the background in a nutshell. So then our research objective here is to improve the effectiveness of information provision to support climate action by farmers. At first, we assess how framing of information messages influences information engagement. And here the idea was that actually the framing of the information messages increases the information engagement. And then in the second part, this is more like an exploratory part, explore implications of that information engagement on how knowledge and intentions to climate action change. Okay, so now, I explained to you how I did that. We conducted a survey that included a randomized treatment with Irish livestock farmers. So Irish livestock farmers were dairy farmers, and what is commonly referred in Ireland to dry stock farmers, so that would be beef and sheep farmers. And I did that in collaboration with the Signpost Programme. So I closely worked with the extension services to conduct the survey. And then the link, it was an online survey, then the individual advisors sent a link to their clients, the farmers, mainly through WhatsApp. So it was an online survey. The data it was done in Qualtrics. The data collection then included kind of general farm characteristics and kind of what greenhouse gas mitigation practices farmers already doing. their attitudes towards the environment and climate change, and then the randomized information experiment, which I'm going to explain in a minute. One other thing here important to note is when we introduced the survey, we didn't say it was about climate change. We introduced it that we wanted farmers' opinions about how advice is delivered, because if you already have climate change, that has a little bit of a kind of loaded message already. So we wanted to avoid that and not influence farmers' kind of participation. We had a stratified randomization based on farm system, because I said before we had dairy and dry stock farmers. Dairy farmers generally are much more extensive and high income, while dry stock would be extensive and low income. So I kind of have those separately, because you have to kind of treat them a little bit separately. There was simple randomization then within each block, 2 treatments and 1 control group, which I'm explaining in the next couple of slides. As a standard, we had ethical approval and pre-registration and open science framework. Okay, so here is treatment number 1. So the treatments were, as I said before, I work closely with the Signpost program. So they're extension agents, advisors, so we worked on it. I also based it on previous data collection in the literature, and we also did a farmer focus group in designing those treatments. And this is what farmers saw. So basically the treatments was that we framed the introduction of the information differently, because the idea was we're kind of increasing the motivation to then engage with the information. So I'm going to read that out to you, because that's what farmers saw. Increasing concerns by society about agriculture greenhouse gas emissions threatens the reputation of the Irish agricultural sector. It is important that every farmer adjusts farm practices to help reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. Every contribution, regardless how small, is valuable. Together, we can make a difference and ensure Irish agriculture retains its environmentally sustainable reputation. In the following, we will give you some information on how you can contribute to this common goal. Reducing chemical and fertilizer is one important step to lowering agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. We give you some tips on how to start. Okay, so this was framing number 1. So 1 group got this. The next one then was relatively kind of straightforward. That was loss aversion. Avoid unnecessary expenses and save the environment too. In the following, we will give you some information on how you can avoid reductions in your income by introducing simple measures on your farm. And then we also had a control group, and they got no introduction. They just got some sort of kind of plain message that we now provide them with some information. Okay, so then the information, so this was the treatment. The information then was all the same for everybody, because otherwise obviously the sample size kind of inflates. So we focused on 3 practices to reduce fertilizer. So I kind of said earlier on, I kind of mentioned there are a number of practices that are promoted, and I think they're promoting at the moment about 20 different practices. So in this survey that was conducted in January of 2022, we promoted those practices that the Signpost program was planning to promote a couple of weeks later. We focused on the application of lime. So lime is generally put on grass to increase the pH of the soil, to that then less fertilizer needs to be applied. And farmers in Ireland certainly apply not enough lime. The implementation of clover. So this is where you can increase, if you implement clover into your sward, they're kind of, I'm not a soil scientist, but they're kind of nitrogen fixing, and then you need less fertilizer. And then the use of protected urea, that is kind of commonly seen as an environmentally friendly fertilizer. So in these, then we had 3 of these infographics. So for all of the 1 infographic, and they were all the same. So they were designed with the advisors, and they were safe fertilizer spread, protected urea. Then we had on all of those, we had how much will I save, had economic information, why, environmental information, and then when, or some sort of kind of management specific information. We ran that by farmers, and farmers then actually wanted to have the economic information first and then the environmental information. Okay, so we had 3 of those, but they all looked similar. So I'm not going to show you all 3 of those. And the order was the same for all farmers. Okay, so then in terms of the data, we received 528 completed responses, 300 dairy farmers, 228 dry stock farmers, and our outcome variables was the engagement with the information. So we measured that in terms of time in seconds, how long farmers spent looking at the infographics. In Qualtrics, you can measure how, when someone kind of moves on to the next page. And then overall, this is for all 3 infographics, farmers spent 58 seconds on average looking at those 3 infographics. That was roughly about 20 seconds per infographics. I think it was slightly shorter for the last one, but not much. So that roughly they spent about 20 seconds on infographics, on each infographic on average. Then we measured knowledge. So that was asked where we asked 6 multiple choice questions after they've seen the infographics, and then we converted those into a continuous score. And we can see that dairy farmers in generally have better knowledge than dry stock farmers. And then we measured stated intentions, what they're planning to do in the year forward in terms of fertilizer in general, but also related to those 3 infographics. Again, this was then converted into continuous score, and dairy farmers again have slightly higher intention than dry stock farmers. I'm not going to all control variables, but I just want to kind of highlight in terms of farm size and age, what you would probably expect if you do an online survey. We have farmers that have larger farms than the kind of Irish farming population, and they're also younger in age. So bear that in mind when we go on. It's not a fully representative sample, but I kind of think 528 observations certainly is an interesting or good sample size. Okay, so then in terms of the results, so this is a regular OLS model with robust standard errors, and we have information engagement measured in seconds as the dependent variable. So here, this is all infographics, so the full time they spent looking at those 3. And then the 2 treatments as dummy variables with the control group as a base category. What we can see here is that reputation significantly reduces the time farmers looked at the infographics by about 15 seconds, and same for loss aversion. Loss aversion had a little bit of a less kind of severe impact. It reduced the time farmers look at these infographics by about 10 seconds. So if we then break it up in those 3 infographics, we can see that actually the impact seems to diminish over time. So this is also the ordering of those infographics. So it appears that farmers actually, by the time they've clicked to the 3 infographics, they may actually already have forgotten about that initial framing, which I think is an interesting result, and certainly gives kind of insights for the next study. Okay, so in the next one, then I run a seemingly unrelated regression model where we have knowledge at first as a dependent variable. So here we can see the longer farmers look at the infographics, that is positively associated with knowledge. But then if you have knowledge, if they have better knowledge, that is positively associated with intention. Obviously here, this is not a randomized treatment anymore. So we're talking about associations here. So kind of that has to be borne in mind, but I still think this is kind of a nice and interesting result, because it shows that even if you're looking something, there seems to be something going on with knowledge and intention. So I think the general idea is worth pursuing. Okay. So then to conclude, information provision is key to achieve sustainable food production, and convincing farmers of the benefits of new technologies can be challenging. And I think here that is important, that it is actually not the actual benefit of the practice, it is the perceived benefit that makes the farmer adopting it. So we need to convince farmers of it. So effective information provision is very important. So what we are finding, that framing of information affects engagement with the information, but as you've seen, not what we were planning to do. So we actually reduced the time they're looking at those infographics. And I'm kind of would be interested to see what your thoughts about it, about this is. So I was kind of thinking about it obviously a little bit more, and kind of looking more closely than at the literature. So does the framing need to be in line with farmers' beliefs? Obviously we designed it with farmers and with advisors and thought that would be in line with farmers' beliefs. But one reason might be, was there some sort of kind of confirmation bias, that there was something they didn't want to hear and then turned away from it? I also did on a different study recently, we conducted some sort of kind of semi-structured interviews with farmers about climate change mitigation, and all of them independently said that they're feeling they're blamed at the moment. So maybe they kind of didn't perceive it as positive, but perceived it as negative. And I think that brought me to another study, which is very different context, but this study find if people get a positive signal about their own ability first, then they're much more likely to listen to that advice and follow it. So maybe we should have given them a much more positive signal. But again, if you have any thoughts about it, I'm happy to hear them. Then the other conclusion is we find an association between information engagement, knowledge, and stated intentions. So two things here, obviously, these are not causal relationships in here. And also, I'm also well aware that we are only asking about intentions because it was actually a relatively small study we conducted. And intentions obviously do not equal adoption. So I'm not kind of saying if a farmer plans to do that, that the farmer is going to plan it, but I think intention is something we need if you want to do something in the future. Okay, so that's from my side, and I want to acknowledge the Chaga Signpost program and all the farmers who completed the survey for us. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you follow up with the farmers after giving this information? Tell them about the technology. Are you worried if there was any perceived as deception, like, oh, I seek information, but I will get some information about it and potential technology, but they finally didn't get any?
What do you mean they didn't get any?
Did you follow up with the farmers after you sent them the treatments, basically, after they came?
No, they did the survey, and the survey was a standalone project, and they got the information. I didn't follow up with them because you wouldn't, unless you ask them for permission, you wouldn't be allowed to actually follow up with farmers about it.
Okay.
So yeah.
Because I felt that the first treatment was kind of promising to give more information about technology.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
Did
No,
you say that
no, they did get, so we did give them those information treatment, and was actually designed in a way that the information was kind of standalone. We also, what I didn't show here, we did ask them a good bit of information, we did ask their opinions, what they thought about the information, and generally that was rated quite highly. They felt it was easy to understand, they learned something, and so on. I didn't have it in here, yeah. I think that the information was not the problem. I think maybe more the framing they didn't seem to like, but yeah.
So first of all, just I wanted you to clarify for me.
Yeah.
Did everybody in the non-control group get the infographic?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Two, can you speak a little bit about the beliefs? I've always been kind of curious about climate change and people's beliefs. Because if I believe that what I do is not going to really make an impact, regardless of what information you tell me, I probably wouldn't want to have a strong intention to change. Right? And then the other thing I'm thinking about too is, if I know that farmer X and farmer Y are going to implement the same thing, I probably will be more likely to want to go along, versus if it's just me being a small fish in a big sea and I can't really make much of an influence, right? So, but I mean, can you just speak more about the beliefs and how that ties into confirmation bias? Yeah,
so actually the beliefs I also have, I did ask, I think about 7 questions altogether about the beliefs. So I think 2, one I found was interesting is that out of the top of that, it was framed something about that if they implement those measures, it will reduce profit. And then 50% of dairy farmers actually said yes to that. And I think that is relatively a good indication that they might be concerned about that. Also, I don't think I said it in my talk, so everything that gets promoted by the Signpost program has certainly on kind of demonstrations farmer proven economic and environmental impact, but that may not materialize on the farm, but farmers think that. I think I also had another statement about generally what they think. I think that's something that they believe if they can make a contribution on their farm. And I think generally there was a kind of tendency to agree to it. So because I was actually surprised how much farmers actually are kind of in line with wanting to do something. So this was your first question. Sorry, what was your second question? Yeah, I kind of wrote it down, but
more farmers go along?
Right. I mean, so if farmer X and Y implement climate change measures, I'm not likely to maybe tag along because I believe that I will make an impact.
No, that is actually, that was
doing it.
Yeah, that was a very good question, and I actually really like the question, but I actually think the opposite, because so they kind of openly say if 60% of farmers will adopt those measures, we will make the target. So I was at a conference where they're kind of open to farmers, where they openly said if 60% of you are doing it, we'll make the target. I would be one of these farmers would be thinking, well, great, I'm one of the 40%. So I kind of just think the opposite, but I really find that interesting. Yeah. So that's, yeah.
And my bad. Did any of the beliefs, did you find that as paralleling the confirmation bias? And so if I believe I can make change, maybe my engagement is higher. And then if I believe, well, I mean, heck, I can't do anything about it, then I don't really care about this information.
You know what? That is actually a very good question, and I must look into it. But I did look into it before that. I actually tried to kind of segment farmers by their climate change attitude, and I didn't really see anything. But I think that is kind of maybe the impact statement. I can look at that in a little bit more detail. But so far, based on, if I divided farmers based on kind of their general climate change attitude, there was no real difference. It was always kind of negative, which I was surprised because I thought I would find more. But I think that is a good comment. I might dig a little bit deeper.
My question is about the application of Lime. You mentioned that
The application of
Lime.
Oh, Lime, yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
So you mentioned that the farmers are not applying enough,
yeah,
and that kind of implies that it's a profitable thing to do it.
yeah.
So why are they not? What makes why do you think they're not applying enough of this input that is profitable?
That is a good question, because maybe they don't know. And so liming also, you need to have soil tests done first, because not everybody needs to put on lime. And I think it's kind of just lack of knowledge, because they're really pushing that at the moment. Yeah. Yeah.
So you've moved from an effect of knowing the information, like the knowledge being associated with how much time you spend in information, and then having also knowledge increasing intention.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you believe that? What's your belief about the connection between intention and actual implementation as a third step in that ladder that you look at? Just your opinion.
Yeah, so I kind of, to be honest, like as I said before, I think you need the intention first to do it. How many would do it in the future? It's a big question. And I think what you should do initially is, but this was kind of just a very small project to follow up actually with the farmers and have a much more severe information treatment, than see, ask for permission, can we contact them again, and then contact them in again. So yeah.
Regarding the sample, what was your attrition rate? How many people, like how many farmers actually got the invite, and how many participated?
So I couldn't tell you that, because we do it by that they got the link sent. And I couldn't tell you how many farmers got the link sent and how many do it. I can only see how many started the survey and how many then dropped out in between the survey. But from that,
How many dropped out?
I would have to go back to quarters to check. There's always surprisingly a lot of people drop out of these surveys. I'd say at least 50% kind of. But I could check. I didn't check like how many click on it and then just give up. But I did a number of surveys in Quartix, and I was surprised how many people actually do not finish the survey in the end.
Because of course, like in the European context, this blaming of farmers is like really big right now.
Yeah.
And if they do feel blamed, like they might not, want to continue because of the confirmation bias. So I do believe that the signaling, like the positive signaling that you put on the last slide, would probably, from a behavioral economic perspective, reveal their preferences maybe better, because they can then deviate from this planning.
I now in hindsight, like you're always smart in hindsight, I agree too. I actually did do the reputation. I did a study on animal welfare before, where farmers actually expressed this kind of reputation concern. So I kind of felt that was good. And we had another treatment as a potential, which was kind of regular kind of social norm treatment. And then the farmers also said they like the focus group we did, they also said they liked the reputation better. And I personally liked it better too, but obviously there must be something that hasn't. But I think the good news is we can influence the engagement. Just need to figure out to kind of turn it around in the right direction. Yeah.
So I have more of like a philosophical question for you, not so much about the survey, but what sort of drives me crazy about a lot of this, and I think the Europeans, even though I know there's several the greatest defenders in terms of setting arbitrary targets. So I forget exactly the theory. So you had a 25% reduction for in agricultural emissions for Ireland by 2030, 50-some%. I mean, and the US has its own, and they're not just climate change. I mean, the EU wants to have 25% of its agriculture be organic by 2030. And, you know, I mean, if I were a farmer, I might want to know, where did those come from? Why is that the right target? Why is it not too little? Why is it not too much? And so, like, what do you think about that as somebody who does this type of research and are trying to motivate farmers to meet arbitrary targets that some people have just made up?
Yeah, so I can see where you're coming from. So there are a number of targets. So I think for this, actually, for the climate change target, this is actually very, like, they have all the sectors, and every sector needs to reduce by a certain percentage then to achieve that overall kind of legally binding EU target. So from that perspective, I think this is actually a reasonably good target, which farmers understands, because I think most farmers in Ireland also understand the kind of urgency of kind of climate change, addressing climate change. But there are plenty of other targets that kind of appear on the policy agenda and then they disappear. For example, when was it, in 2000, I think for 2010, they had the target to 5% of farmers under organic farming. The government changed, this target has disappeared. So it does often happen. We also had a target then when the milk quota was abolished, they wanted to increase milk production by 50%. So that target was arbitrarily set, that they actually achieved it. So I can see where you're coming from. There's a lot of targets, a lot of change, and I think there is kind of frustration with farmers, but I think for this target, I think farmers do take it seriously because I think there is pressure and I think they do understand the importance of it. That makes sense to you?
Just echoing this question, today, you know, Irish dairy producers are very efficient, and unlike some dairy producers in the rest of Europe,
Yeah.
you know, and do you look at this target? Do you consider looking at these targets as, you know, greenhouse reduction per value of the product that it creates? You know, because if you look at it that way, maybe if some French and German producers of dairy reduced it more, then it would be, well, you know, per gas emission unit, more kind of profitable for the Europe as general.
I think
So, or this is just country level.
so. This is country level, and I can see in that argument always comes up, and this is certainly where the agricultural lobby from Ireland always comes, because Ireland kind of claims to be very efficient in producing dairy and also beef in terms of greenhouse gas efficiency. Within a European context, Ireland is actually relatively level. If you then go into other countries, Ireland is much better in producing in terms of dairy and beef in terms of greenhouse gas efficiency. Dairy production probably will continue to be relatively large because it's profitable, where they're kind of probably making reductions just from the beef because beef is unprofitable for years. So then the argument is made that then Brazil will come and kind of supply the beef at higher greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram. That is often come, but I don't think that is true. Many others also say that is not true because there are many other kind of European or other producers who would step in and kind of supply that. So I think, to be honest, that's a fair comment. It is a very difficult puzzle, and these are kind of country level targets. Do they make sense on a global scale? I'm not sure, but like we need to do something, and I think we kind of just need to start, kind of just say, okay, other countries, you do it. We're kind of continuing. So,
But would if you looked at dairy and dry stock in the other EU countries, would they have the same target, or is that something that's Ireland specific?
That is very Ireland specific, because Ireland has these high proportion of greenhouse gas emission from agriculture. I know that other countries also have targets, but to be honest, I'm actually not 100% sure. Maybe you can help us out. What are the greenhouse gas reduction targets for German agriculture? They do have some, but not as severe.
Like in one state where they have a lot of pigs.
Yeah.
They have like severe like nitrogen targets to meet.
Yeah.
But then it's at state level.
Yeah. So I don't know, but like all countries need to reduce, and I think it's over for each country. It is the general greenhouse gas emission reduction. And then they're probably divided up based on proportions, how much each sector has, but every other EU country has about 10% of agriculture greenhouse gas emissions, so they can kind of start somewhere else.
Find any evidence of information avoidance?
Not in this one, because I actually didn't directly measure it. I can so not really. But I also looked in terms of could I divide farmers in terms of how long they look? Did I find out farmers who looked very closely? Again, there wasn't much. I must look again closer, but so far I didn't find anything either. Yeah.
Okay, I like this discussion, but our time has passed for the next presentation, so I want to move on to. Okay, I will be introducing my work on economic and climatic determinants of farmer suicide in the US. My advisors are Pierre Morel and Rich Sexton, who is here. And I'm glad to introduce him to everyone. He's super awesome. So yeah. Okay. So farming has a very high suicide rate in the US. It is about 3 times of the rates of the general population, and it's also the highest among all the occupational groups. So this graph shows the suicide rates by the level of urbanization. We can see that as the urbanization level goes down, the suicide rates goes up. And we can see that here, this is the highest group, non-core, which is about 22 per 100,000 population. This number, the farmer suicide rate is double of this number, which means that there must be something unique about farmers that they are so vulnerable to suicide. And the question comes, why do farmers commit suicide? There are various reasons. For example, economic reasons. Farm income has been dropping steadily since 2013. And I think as price takers, farmers, they have very little market power relative to their downstream trade partners. And they may feel hopeless in many cases as they don't have many control over the market. And also health issues. Farmers are usually exposed to chemicals from pesticide, and also they live in the rural area, so the social isolation is a big problem for them. And there are other factors, like they usually have high access to lethal means to protect their farms. And climate change may be another factor to farmer suicide, not only because farmers, they expose themselves a lot in the environment, in the weather conditions, but also their livelihood highly depend on the weather conditions. Recent published studies, for example, Burke and Carlton, find that the suicide rate among the general population rise with temperature. However, there is no evidence exists for farmers. And the effect they identified is basically a trigger effect, which means when the temperature is high, people just have the thoughts or the ideation that they want to kill themselves. However, the mechanism is very different for farmers. On top of that trigger effect, there is an underlying mechanism of temperature for farmers. The weather will predominantly influence the quantity of their output, and that will change their income, and that effect will go through their utility and eventually will change their reception of the future utilities. And that will eventually influence their suicide decision if we consider the decision is a rational choice. So my research question is to ask what are the effects of weather climates and economic factors on farmer suicide in the US. We want to address the causal factors, and we want to improve our understanding of why farmer suicide is such a serious issue in the US, and we hope to raise people's awareness and improve the effectiveness of the suicide prevention. We start our analysis with a theoretical model, but due to the time limitation, I will skip this part and I'll go to the hypothesis. Our theory model has the following hypothesis: that the marginal effect of beneficial weather on farmer suicide is negative, and the harmful weather has a positive effect on farmer suicide. And it's more importantly that it's a successive realization of bad weather events or adverse economic conditions that will have a snowballing effect on their decision through their expectations of future bad weather or bad economy conditions. So I will go strict to the empirical analysis, starting with the data. We have three main data sets. The first one is the non-public vital statistics by the CDC. We obtained the individual death information for each records of the individual level data from 1999 to 2017 at the county level. And then we don't have the information on the occupational for each records, but we do have the location of where they committed suicide. So we use the suicide location on the farm as a proxy for farmer suicide. And this data has revealed some interesting demographic information about the suicide farmers. So for example, the majority of the farmers who committed suicide are white male. This is consistent with the demographic of the farmers in general. And the mean age of the farmer are 42 years old. That's already older than the other occupational groups. And the average age of farmer who committed suicide is also very high. So it seems like aging is a problem for farming industry as a whole, and people at older age is at higher risk of suicide. And this is the education level for farmers. I want to do a direct comparison of the education level of deceased farmers and the farmer as a general population, but I cannot find data on education level of farmers. But I do find this, this is education level in rural areas where most of the farmers live. So we can see that most of the farmer, they have high school or less education level. So I think this might be another indicator that improving education can reduce suicide rate among farmers. This is the manner of death of suicide. The majority of the suicide is happened by using the firearms, which is consistent with the literature that access to lethal means is really a problem. It has its beneficial effect that they can protect their farms, but it also has this problem that they could access to this means. Okay, and then our second data is the daily weather data, and we also have the USDA NAS to construct the economic index. And because our Y variable is, we reconstruct the individual level to a county year panel. So our Y variable is farmer suicide count in a Poisson model for count data. And our X variables are the weather variables, including cumulative precipitation over the growing season, and also the degree days. following the Roberts and Schlenker methods. And our growing season is from March 1st to September. And next, we construct economic variables by calculating the deviation, percentage deviation from the mean for 10 leading agricultural products in the US. And then we use a weight by calculating this share using the sales. And then we do a sum product of the price deviation and the weight to construct an index to measure the overall condition of agricultural prices in a county in a year. And then we have, so if this number is higher, which means the overall condition of the prices are good, and vice versa. We select the following 10 leading products. Some of them, for example, the crops, can be the feed for the livestock production. So to avoid a potential endogenous problem, we separate these 10 products into 5 and 5, 5 as crop index and the other 5 used in the animal index. And to further deal with this potential endogenous problem, we have created a dummy variable to identify if a county is crop dominating or animal dominating. And then based on this dummy variable, we have 2 specifications for the regression. The first one is to let the dummy variables to interact with the index. And then the other one is straightforward. We just run 2 separate regressions, one for the crop dominating counties, the other one for the animal dominating counties. And we also include on top of the on-year indexes, we have 2-year moving average, 3-year moving average index to measure if the prolonged bad economic condition will have a bigger effect on farmer suicide. Let's go to the results. First, the precipitation, we find a positive association between precipitation and farmer suicide in general. However, we don't find anything in the non-irrigated counties subsample and irrigated counties subsample. So to further analyze this, we decompose the total effect of precipitation on farmers into 2 parts. One is the trigger effect, the psychological one, and the other one is the effect through the farming channel. We use the same regression, but we replace the Y variable to the non-farmers suicide count to as a proxy to analyze the psychological effect. And this is what we found. We found a positive effect in non-irrigated counties and a slightly negative effect in irrigated counties. This is consistent with the literature of the effect of precipitation on the general population. In the irrigated counties, that's the place dry and hot. And like in the tropical areas, literature usually found more rainfall will cause more suicide. And in the drought areas like Australia, the precipitation usually have a negative effect on suicide. So this, on top of the psychological effect, we don't have direct evidence of the effect through the farming channel, but we can do a weak inference from comparing these 2 findings. And if basically we find no connection between precipitation and farmer suicide, but we, based on this comparison, we can infer that in the irrigated counties, when the farmers has already adopted to the dry or drought, having more precipitation might have a slightly positive effect on suicide. And in the non-irrigated counties, where the rainfall is already sufficient, having more precipitation might have a negative effect, but we want to stay with the no effect results because this is not significant evidence. It's just a weak inference from the 4 sets of regressions we have. And the next is the degree days. The degree day is a great indicator for crop yield. And we can see this cubic trend of degree days. The most of data is located in between these 2 extreme point here. And this dashed line represents the percentile of the degree days. And we can see that the moderate heat accumulation is beneficial for farmers. They reduced farmer suicide curve. And then this curve turns up when passing the second extreme point, which means there might be some association between extreme heat and farmer suicide. But we can see that the confidence band becomes wider and wider as the degree is increasing. So it's at best the weak evidence we find that there might be some positive association between high degree days and farmer suicide. This is a similar margin plot, but we do with the second specification when we separate the crop dominating and animal dominating counties. And we can see that it's very interesting. The crop dominating curve does not turn up as the animal dominating counties does. So this is an interesting finding that it means that crop farmers may adapt to extreme heat way better than animal farmers. There are multiple reasons. I think first, crop farmers, they can apply irrigation system to deal with the heat, dry conditions. And we further run this regressions to compare irrigated counties and non-irrigated counties. And we see that in irrigated counties, there is not much effect of degree days on farmer suicide. It's nearly flat. But in non-irrigated counties, it follows the trend like we found before. So I think irrigation is really beneficial. It's a great technology for farmers, especially crop farmers. And another finding is that this comparison show us that animal farmers may suffer more from the extreme heat compared to crop farmers because the animals are less productive under heat, and heat is a significant stressor for the animals. And also this will reduce their yield and income and impact animal farmers adversely financially, but also mentally because compared to the crop farmers, when they usually follow annual cycles, it's more devastating for animal farmers to see their animal die from the heat because they usually have like a longer production cycle, for example, for cows, usually 4 to 6 years. And they have like the more closer relationship between animal farmers and their animals compared to when crop farmers experience a failure caused by the extreme heat. So this is our main findings from degree days. And for the economic index, this is the coefficient for 1 year, the on-year index, 2-year moving average, and 3-year moving average. It's very interesting that a single year of low prices is not associated with farmer suicide in the same year. But when we have the prolonged bad conditions, like 2 years, they start to show significance. And then 3 years, it's really a problem for the farmers that it's the chronic poor economic conditions that really have a bad influence on farmer suicide. Okay. since we have some time, I'll just show one more slides. Okay, well, I'll just go to the conclusion. So basically, we find a general positive association between precipitation and farmer suicide in general. We don't have that clear evidence on the effect of precipitation on farmers when we separate the samples into irrigated counties and non-irrigated counties. And we do find moderate cumulative heat can reduce farmer suicide. That's considered as a growing or beneficial range of the degree days. And then we find a weak evidence that the high degree days, the high heat accumulation is one of the factors for farmer suicide. And the more important factor is the economic factor. The chronic poor economic conditions can motivate farmer suicide. That's all for research. Thank you. Yes.
It's really fascinating. I had no idea that farmer suicide was even a problem, so thank you for shedding light on this.
Oh, thank you.
And I don't know, so pardon my ignorance if it's kind of out of scope, but in terms of economic effects, was it possible to capture like economic safety nets? Like if I have some insurance to fall on in bad times, I may be less amenable to wanting to end it than if I don't. I don't know if it was even feasible at all to want to capture some of these aspects in the economic effect to see whether that had any impact.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So like irrigation crop index is another way to adapt to the bad weather or economic conditions. Our data is a county year panel, so we won't be able to capture individuals' decision on crop insurance. But I think crop insurance is like implemented by the county information. We do have the we have another version of regressions with county fixed effects. I think that might absorb some of the decisions there, but yeah, it will be great to know more detailed like crop insurance information that will help to improve the model. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
One like super basic question.
Yeah.
Suicide data in the US reliable?
I think so. The data is from CDC as a very reliable organization, and I think US has a very systematic way to record death information from I think 1960. So I think there is very credible data for that. An interesting question is like when I talk my research to people in China, they always say, oh, you can do this in China, it will be interesting. The problem is China probably won't have reliable information on the suicide data, especially on farmers. So yeah, but I do believe US government.
Because in Germany, actually, it's underreported. In Germany, official suicide states are underreporting real suicide dates.
Oh.
So the question is, how are they actually being collected and who reports? If it's family members, they might actually underreport, because officially they don't want the family member to have committed suicide.
Oh, so there is like a negative stigma on committing suicide. Okay. Yeah, I do find that it's common for in general population when it's associated with religions. Like for some certain religions, it's definitely a bad thing to commit suicide. Yeah. So yeah.
Just to follow up on this, but that's just limited to kind of people. Someone at 46 commits a suicide. It's really hard to say, they died of old age unless, the alternative is murder. I mean, how do you conceal it?
You mean the?
If it's viral.
Yeah.
So,
a stroke or heart attack. I mean, it is right?
yeah, but it's harder to kind of convince people. I don't know. So if that's a problem, I think it's a very limited problem.
I mean, that we never know, right?
Yeah. No, I'm just trying to think of the scope of it.
Yeah, but the majority was by firearm, right? And
Yeah.
then poisoning is pretty high. So I think, yeah, I think Georgie's point is that, yeah, because you may have incentive to unreport before, like for life insurance, and you can't kill yourself and have your family can collect. So I think that's a good point, but
Yeah.
yeah, hopefully the manners in which people commit suicide will make it hard to obfuscate. You didn't kill yourself, I killed. Gotta have insurance.
Yeah, Tina.
I was wondering if you have any understanding of per county, what are the alternative employments in the county? What's the employment rate of alternative jobs than farmers? I'm just curious if you can somehow make an inference how many of the records you observe are actually farmers.
How many of the records?
So do you know if there are other types of employments per county other than just being a farmer? And what's the percentage? What's the likelihood that your data represent farmers?
I think it's shown on the first slides. It's the farm managers, ranchers. Like these are not the hired laborers on farms. They are like the owner, mainly the owner of the farms. So that's there's a difference between our ag workers and ag managers. So this study is focused on the managers. So they not only need to invest their money to the farm, but also their capital, like human capital, into the farm. Like they have to be responsible for their farm in many aspects. And in the US, usually the farms are like passing down the generations. Like if you are a farmer, you usually pass down your business to your son, your grandson. And if you are taking the business from your ancestors, you have like the strong feeling of responsibility to make the business survive. So that's a unique story for the US farmers. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about the data group. Since you use the county year level data, right?
Yeah.
So the weather is the average data at the whole year, right?
Over the growing season for each county.
So yeah, I heard that the suicide is a mental problem and maybe it's accumulate. You know, maybe it's a year lag.
Yeah.
So do considering try to 1 year late data about the suicide and 1 year before the suicide data for match the weather?
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mental health is not immediately.
Yeah, so it's similar to the economic index. We can definitely do the 2-year, 3-year moving average index for the weather variables. That will be very valuable to have. And also, yeah, like you said, using lagged terms for the y variable. That's also another way to deal with it. Yeah, I think I'll definitely try that. Okay. We're on time. Thank you. And thank you, Laura and Doris, for sharing your great projects. It's I'm glad to moderate this session, and I hope to see you in the future again.